Today we're going to start our unit on cells. What's inside of cells, what makes them up, how do they work, how do they keep you going. But before we can really get into the little bits and pieces that make up a cell, we need to get a little bit of the history behind how we discovered that cells even existed. I'm going to start with a little repeat from what we've learned before, and that is the characteristics that all living things share. Remember that we listed these items as every single living thing has all of these characteristics. It's a check mark to see if something is alive. And one of those characteristics is that they are made of cells, because all living things have this little working unit known as the cell. They also have some level of organization. In humans, we go from cells to tissues to organ systems to an organism. All living things grow and develop and reproduce. Those two kind of go together. You reproduce, you have a little baby, it grows up, it develops into something that is different than when it was born, into an adult that then reproduces itself. All living things respond to stimuli, whether that be a dog barking when the doorbell rings, or a plant turning its leaves towards the sun. All living things acquire and use energy, plants from the sun, animals from eating plants or eating other animals. All living things maintain homeostasis. We've been talking about how important it is to maintain a specific pH range and a specific temperature range so that our proteins don't denature. And all living things adapt or evolve over time. So let's start our study of cells by learning the cell theory. The cell theory has 3 parts. You need to make sure that you can recognize all 3 parts and understand what they mean. So the 3 parts to the cell theory are: the cell is the basic unit of life. So all living things have cells. Remember before we said that the basic unit of all things, both living or non, is the atom. Okay? The atom makes up every single thing on Earth, living and non-living. But the cell is special just to life. And it is a working unit. If you take a cell apart, it no longer works. It no longer functions. So the cell is the basic unit, meaning it is the smallest functioning thing that exists for life. All living things are made of cells. Anything that you find, if you look at it under a microscope and finds out it has cells, then it's alive. All plants, animals, and bacteria are made of cells. And finally, cells come from pre-existing cells. Cells don't just magically, spontaneously arise out of nothing. Cells reproduce to make more cells. If you cut yourself and you damage your skin and you need more skin cells, your surrounding skin cells will reproduce to make more cells. They don't just magically arise. So let's talk about some of the scientists that made it possible for us to study cells. Our first one is Anton Van Leeuwenhoek. He invented the first microscope. So he was the first one to see microscopic organisms such as bacteria and protists. Before Leeuwenhoek, we didn't know that there were things smaller than what we could see. We didn't know that there was bacteria. We had no idea that there was this whole other microscopic world out there. But thanks to him, we now know they exist. So before Leeuwenhoek, they didn't know that bacteria existed, so they didn't know that that's how you got sick. They thought you got sick by having too much blood in your system, so they would bleed you. Or you had too much bile in your system, and so they would force you to have diarrhea or vomit. They thought that's what made you sick. They thought that taking baths made you sick. So they used to have these bathhouses where they would go and maybe bathe once a month, once every 2 months. And a lot of times they got sick afterwards because they didn't change the water. So one dirty, smelly person who hadn't bathed for 2 months would get into a bathtub and clean and wash, and then after he got out, the same water sitting there, somebody else got in, and they didn't change the water out very often, and so people got sick, and they thought it was because of the water. It wasn't until after the invention of the first microscope that they took a water sample and found out, oh, there's these little things living in the water, and those are what makes us sick. And now we know showers and baths are a good thing, and so we bathe much more often. Here's Leeuwenhoek's very first microscope ever invented, to see the very first cells. Next we have Robert Hooke. So he used the microscopes of the day, and he was the first one to come up with the word cells. So Robert Hooke was a monk, and when he looked at a sample of cork, he saw all these regular rows of little square boxes. And he says, oh, those look like our rooms at the monastery. And they called their rooms cells. So he goes, oh, these things look like cells. And so now that's what we call them. So Robert Hooke is famous because he came up with the word cells. And here's the sample of cork that he looked at. You can see how you can see those regular rows of squares that to him looked like his monastery bedrooms. Then we had Robert Brown. He is famous because he noticed that every single cell that he looked at had this dark area in the center. And all cells had this. And so he said, that is the nucleus, the center of the cell. So he is famous for coming up with the term nucleus to represent the dark region of a cell. Now these two guys are clumped together because they did similar work, but they actually didn't work together. They worked in different countries. But this is Theodor Schwann and Matthias Schleiden. Schleiden and Schwann. Now, Schleiden worked with plants, and he looked at hundreds of thousands of different plant samples from different trees and flowers and bushes and grasses. And he said after looking at hundreds of thousands of samples, he determined, yes, 100% of plants are made of cells. Schwann worked with animals, and he's easy to remember because his name sounds like a swan, which is an animal. So Schwann worked with animal cells. And he looked at hundreds of thousands of samples of animal cells, from worms to insects to humans to dogs to monkeys to cats to cows. And he said every single animal is made out of cells. So these two together get one part of the cell theory. All living things are made of cells because of these two guys working separately. Our last scientist is Rudolf Virchow. He is the scientist that gets his own part of the cell theory, which is that cells come from pre-existing cells. He was the first scientist to sit in front of a microscope for so long and watch cells for so long that he got to see the cells reproduce. He saw one cell turn into two cells. So that's pretty cool. He was lucky that he was studying a cell that had a very short life, so they reproduced quickly, and he was able to watch that. So he gets his very own part of the cell theory. Now, back in these scientists' day, the microscopes weren't that great. They couldn't see too much. But today, we have some amazing microscopes, and we can see all kinds of little bits and pieces inside of the cell. So all thanks to new and amazing microscopes. In class, we'll be using what's called a light microscope, which is a little bit better than what they were using, and we will be able to see several different bits and pieces. But the really good microscopes are the scanning electron microscope and the transmission electron microscope. These let you see the smallest pieces inside of the cell. Unfortunately, they cost tens of thousands of dollars, so we won't get to use them, but you can look up pictures on the internet and see all kinds of pictures that you can get from these. The scanning electron microscope creates a 3D image. It bounces electrons off of your sample and sends it into a reader that then creates the image on your computer screen for you. Now, the bad thing about the scanning electron microscope is it costs a lot of money to run because you have to coat your sample in pure gold for the electrons to be able to bounce off. But the cool thing is you can find websites where they will actually sell old samples as necklaces. And so you can buy a scientific gold-plated cellular sample, which I think is pretty cool. Now, the other one, the transmission electron microscope, this one you have a special machine that slices your sample so thin that it is only 1 cell thick, but it creates very, very detailed images. So here's a nice image that was created with a microscope, and then it was colored by a digital software enhancement so that you can see the different parts of the cells. These are brain cells, and you can see how they are interconnected.